that I've come to know about building text editors for the web. So you see on the screen, this is an image of a screenshot of the Twitter tweet editor. By a show of hands, how many of you tweeted at least once in your lifetime? Oh, that's a surprisingly low number. But as you can see that the text reads, "Hi React, let's talk about text editors." And there's a mention, and there's a hashtag text editors. And they're decorated accordingly to distinguish between what's what, the plain text and the special mention and hashtag components. So this is the example of a rich text editor. If you ever wondered on how this could be made possible, on how you could build rich text editors, well, that's what I'm here for, that's what I'm going to talk about. Before that, a little bit about me. My name is Shai. I used to be a Python developer working in computational biology, and about a couple of years ago, I started writing JavaScript and React a couple of months later, and I absolutely love these technologies. I also write about what I find interesting on JavaScript, React, and the corresponding ecosystem, and you can find some of my writings at hashnode.com/@psyche. Speaking of Hashnode, it is touted as a premier network for software developers. If you haven't already checked it out, check them out at hashnode.com. I used to work there as a software engineer and developer evangelist. Among many other things, I have experimented, built, and architected across the full stack, the text editors of the Hashnode platform. These days, I work at this company called MGRM, where I lead an engineering team, and we build, among other things, software for government, or as we like to call them, e-governance applications. Now, I would like to talk more about Hashnode and MGRM. Just feel free to grab me at the end of the talk. So moving on, the main topic of the day is building text editors for the web. And because we are at React Fuel, we'll see that with React. Before we delve into the details, I find it better to understand the paradigms, the different paradigms, the different modes of text editors that exist, so that we can appreciate all the problems that are involved in building these text editors. To start with, you have the source code view, where there is no structure as such, and any structure that there might be is managed by you as the editor, as the writer. So for example, if you have a plain text editor where you're writing Markdown, now you have hash space something. You, as you write, know that is a header level 1 in Markdown, but the editor doesn't give a hoot. And moving on, we have what I call Visivim editors, which is what you see is what you mean. Here, some sort of semantic structure is managed by you as a writer, and some sort of semantic structure is internally managed as data by the editor. So to give you an example, if you've ever worked with simple MDE, it is an example of a Visivim editor where you still have to write Markdown, you still have to say hashtag space for H1, but the editor interface comes up and says, hey, I know that this is going to be header level 1, and I'll assist you by increasing the font size, so you already know how it's rendered, and lo and behold, it renders like that. And finally, we have the Visivim mode of editors, where the entire semantic meaning, the entire semantic structure is managed by the editor. So Hashnode editor is a good example for a Visivim editor. You can see images, you can see headers, you can see code inline styles, bold inline styles, and it displays the end product on how it's going to be rendered, right? So those are the three paradigms: the source code view, the Visivim view, and the Visivim view. Now moving on. Fun fact, Hashnode editor has seen all these modes. First off, we had a plain text editor where developers came in and just wrote Markdown, and then we had the Visivim with simple MDE, and finally we used this rich text editor framework called Draft.js, built for React, and which I'm going to talk about. So what does this got to do with building text editors for the web, right? So plain text editors are easy, right? You just plop in a text area, and then you're good to go. But are they? We will come back to plain text editors at the end of the talk. They're not as simple as they seem. But let's discuss about building rich text editors for the web. So, sorry. This is from React.js Conference 2016, a talk given by Isaac Hellendag, where they open source GraphJS. He's the creator of GraphJS. So he talks about the rich text editing solutions that Facebook used pre-2014. And because they were rich text editors like Google Docs way before, but there was not much discussion that revolved around this, and there were not very many good open source solutions. So if you were starting with a fresh code base, then the solutions to build rich text editors would either fall into these two silos, right? The first one, you would have a normal text editor where you have plain text to write, and you would manage a different decoupled data model where you would know which set of the characters are special characters, and then you would calculate the position of those characters in the DOM, and then you would add new DOM elements, so they would be decorated accordingly. I don't know about you, but that's a very hacky solution. And if I can borrow the clean code lingo, this code smells. But it worked, and a lot of people use these sort of solutions. And the second solution was to add the content editable attribute to a div. Content editable is equal to true. And when you do that, all the contents inside the div would become editable. You can have H1s, you can have bold text, you can have span with fancy decorations, and all that. But if you search Google for why content editable is terrible, this is the first article that you're going to get. And this is written by an ex-Medium engineer, and if you have all seen Medium Editor, it's very well done, where he proves axiomatically on why content editable is a terrible abstraction for building rich text editors. And why is that? Well, the gist of it, or at least part of the gist of it is that content editable produces markup that varies widely across different browsers. As an example, if you are to press enter in Chrome, it would give you new p tags, but whereas in Firefox, if you press enter, it would add a br tag. Now you can imagine if you're building a rich text editor for an audience base which can come from any browser base, this is going to be a terrible solution to maintain. It would be hard to keep it in sync across all the different browsers unless you have a very good abstraction. So that is the problem, right? But how do we build proper Wysiwyg editors? Like, how do we build a really solid text editor that works across all the browsers so we can all be happy? Well, Nick Santos does leave us with a solution, and this is the main takeaway of the talk, right? If you understand this talk, you can all just go home, but I would say please stay until the end of the talk. So there are three things, right? The first thing is that you need to have a data model that represents the entire editor state. Now this is the content, this is the selection, the position of the cursor, whether a selection is collapsed or is it across a range, all that stuff. The second thing is that you need to have a well-defined set of edit operations. For example, if you want to add some characters, say, to the data model, you need to have an add characters operation which would take the old data model and it would spit out these characters added to that specific data model. And number three, this is the important part, that the data model should have a one-on-one map to the DOM. So this is akin to pure functions, right, where you, for a certain argument, you'll always get a certain output. So you need to have a one-on-one mapping from the data model to the DOM. Combine all these three things, Nick Santos says, would give you a model for building really solid text editors that would work everywhere. So a data model to represent your entire editor state, a well-defined set of edit operations, and a one-on-one mapping from that data model to the DOM. And that's how the Medium Editor works. But that's all we knew because, as you might know, Medium Editor is closed source. The first really solid open source solution that came along, that built along with this model, is Prose Mirror by this guy called Marhin Haberback. It also comes with these neat features like collaborative editing out of the box, and it has the data model decoupled from the way it's rendered in the DOM. But that's not what we would delve into today. What we're going to look at is Draft.js. About a month after Prose Mirror got open sourced, Draft.js also got open sourced in React.js Conference 2016 by Isaac Hellenbach. So what Draft.js gives you? Draft.js uses content editable. What we just said, content editable is terrible. But what Draft.js does is it takes all the good parts of content editable and it normalizes all the terrible parts of content editable so that the rendered markup is same across all the browsers. And it also gives you an immutable data model which represents an entire editor state. This involves the content, the selection, where the position of the cursor is, and all the good stuff. Now, I would like to take a moment here to tell you why Immutable.js is awesome and why it fits so beautifully in this context of for maintaining the data model for Draft.js. Is because Immutable.js has what I call persistent data structures, right? So if you want to edit a piece of data, you don't edit it in place, but you make a copy of that data and then you edit that data. So this makes undo, redo a piece of cake, right? Because essentially you have the entire history of the editor. You can just go back and print, and that works beautifully. But you might have a follow-up question for those of you who are memory nerds and stuff. Isn't this memory inefficient because you're maintaining, copies and copies of data? But the answer is no, because Immutable.js also comes with this ability of structural sharing. What that essentially means is that only that data which you're editing gets copied, and the rest of the data is just shared with this new copy. In this example, if you see, you're editing the F node, and the only nodes that reference F are D and G. So those are copied, and the edit is made, and the rest of the structure is shared with the old structure. So Immutable.js is really awesome. You have undo, redo done, and whatever data you're maintaining in Draft.js solved. So I recommend watching this React.js Conference 2015 talk by Lee Byron, who's the creator of Immutable.js, where he talks about the implementation of these data structures as what I call trees. And he also says that the outward-facing API is just lists and maps that an average JavaScript developer, it's purely intuitive, so you can consume it and then be happy. So, and finally, Draft.js also gives you a well-defined set of APIs to edit this immutable data model. So where does that leaves us? We have the model, Nick Santos' model for a solid text editor, these 3 points, a data model to represent your entire editor state, a well-defined set of edit operations, and a one-on-one mapping of this data model to the DOM. And Draft.js gives you an immutable data model which represents an entire editor state. It gives you a well-defined set of APIs for editing this data model. And because of its normalized content editable behavior, which behaves the same across all the different browsers, you have that one-on-one mapping of the data model to the DOM. Draft.js is a solid editor. And you're all React fans, right? React foo-hoo. You can declare this editor declaratively. You can just import it from the Draft.js. And those of you who know about control components, this looks similar to the control input component, where in the state of editor state, you would have value. Here we have an editor state, which is an immutable data structure, which represents the entire editor state. And you have an onChange function. And the state is managed in the parent component. So I have created this little interactive sort of a tutorial called Learn Draft.js, and it sort of moves through all the core parts of JS. Draft.js has a little bit of a steeper learning curve, so I created this to help with that. So I'll quickly just demo you the different core parts of Draft.js. So here we are, and this is what I wanted to show you. You can peruse at your own convenience, but we'll quickly skim through it. As we know, the dependencies of Draft.js are, of course, React and React DOM, and immutable, and Babel polyfill because I'm using the Create React app. So the simplest possible editor. Is the code visible to everyone at the back? it's not, I'll just increase the font. How about now? Awesome. So you just import that editor and editor state from Drop.js, and it is a control component, right? The state is initialized by calling createEmpty on this top level editor state object, and then you have an onChange function which gets the new editor state whenever there's a change in the editor state, and it sets the state. That's the simplest possible example for a draft editor. Moving on, what we are here to see is the data model on how it represents all this data. So if I write something, React foo, all right, pardon my capitalization and misspelling. All right, so if I press log editor state, don't freak out, it spits out all this data. But it's really simple, right? It's all just, it's just a big fat JavaScript data structure. So to give you a brief, how it works is you have an editor state, the editor state top level object, and in the editor state, you have all these different things, right? Selection state is to represent the position of the cursor in the editor, and you have content state, which is the meat of the editor, where your content lies. Content state is a list of content blocks, and content blocks are akin to paragraphs, and each content block has a list of characters. And all of these are immutable data structures. And you also have these special things called entities and decorators, which we'll see in action shortly. So that's the data model, and the selection state is where your position of the cursor is. So if I write hi, I can see it in the console that it is at anchor offset 2 and anchor key. So different blocks have different keys to mention the position of where the cursor is at and whether the editor has focus or not. Moving on, content state is the meat of the editor, right? Where all your content is managed. And if I may write something here, React foo, and you can see the content state, an example, the JavaScript representation of the content state. So there is only one block, and that block has this key, and it has this character list. So for every character, you have a JavaScript object mentioning the style. So it can have inline style bold, it can have inline style red, whatever you want. And it has this special thing called entity. Now entities are used for mentioning metadata on each of the characters. So for example, if you have a link in a text, then you would use an entity to represent the URL part of the data in that in entity for that particular character. So that is content state. I'm just skimming through. You can always visit learn.drop.js.now.sh to get the detailed overview. And then finally, you have decorators. So I'll just give you an overview. Hi, React foo. This is our original tweet. Let's talk about text editors. So you can see that they are decorated accordingly. We have a mention component at React foo, and we have a hashtag component. One is in blue, and the other one is in green. So how is this possible? Decorators are simply a combination of two things called a strategy and a component. A strategy is a function which combs through your entire content and finds patterns of text, and whenever it finds those patterns, it replaces that text with the specified component. That's the component part. So if I can show you the code, so you have handle strategy and handle span, and handle strategy, all it does is it finds the content with the particular regex, and then it replaces it with that particular handle span component. So those are decorators. And finally, we come to entities. Now, entities are used to specify metadata on characters, right? So for example, we have three entities here, Superman, Batman, and Green Lantern. If I click on Batman, you can see in the console that there is an in the console that there is an in the console that there is an in the console. A type can be anything. A type is just a name given to identify the entity on the character. and then you have a mutability, which we'll see right now, and then there's a data part. So if you want to add some URL to your characters, this is where it would go. As an example, we can add a entity to characters. So I'll say mutability is mutable. We'll see what mutability is. The type is link. Type can be anything. And the data is, let's say, react2.in. And now when I add the entity, so we can see in the console that the type is link, mutability is mutable, and it has a data with the URL attribute called react2.in. Now what is mutability? Mutability, there are 3 types of mutability for entities. The first one is immutable, and you might have guessed it right. If you delete anything, then you would sort of, the entire range of characters, of contiguous range of those characters for the entity will be deleted. And then you have mutable entity, so this will be Batwoman. And then there are segmented entities. If you ever use Facebook mentions, you already know what segmented entities are. So if I delete any character, then that particular segment would be removed. Segment here is defined by the white space separator. So that is a very crude overview of the entire entire data model of Draft.js. I've not delved into any code here. I just wanted to show you, like this was the most confusing part when I specifically started with Draft.js. So now that you have a mental model, you can use this website to go through the code. It's really intuitive. The API is awesome. So that's Draft.js for you. Moving on. So this is the data model, right? You have the edit state, you have the selection state, decorators, entities, and content state with content blocks with a list of characters in them. And there's a lot more to Draft.js, as I've just said. It gives you all these cool abilities to style blocks in a really fancy way. You can have custom inline styles. You can do all sorts of cool stuff. And you can you can check out Draft.js docs or learn Draft.js to get up to speed. So we have discussed building rich text editors and the model for building a solid text editor. Can we apply what we have learned for plain text areas, for normal input components? This is a takeaway, right? These 3 key points: a data model to represent an entire REST state, a well-defined set of edit operations, and a one-on-one mapping of the data model to the DOM. If you do apply this to a normal text area in React, you might have heard of control text areas. If we apply this, I say that we get what I call tightly controlled text areas. Let me quickly demonstrate on what they look like. So there is a secret route here. All right, so we are very well aware of control text areas, right? So when I write something, hi, Sai, hello. So the content is entirely managed by as a state in the parent component. So this is the control text area. You have a ref to this component, and you have a value. And whenever a change occurs, the on change is fired, and the state is set to the content. Now, if I might ask you, does this help us in building a solid model of text editor? Does this solve all the points that Nick Santos has originally given us, has originally mentioned on building a solid text editor? I would say no, because we're just managing the content. What about the selection? So we don't have access to the selection state on where the position of the cursor is. So the step 1 of building a solid text editor, right? We should be able to represent the entire editor state in a data model. So the selection is missing. That's simple, right? We'll just add a new attribute to the state, call it selection, and it'll have a start offset, and then it'll have an end offset. Step number 2, the data model should have a well-defined set of edit operations. And this is also simple. we can just pass in specific content and a selection model, and then the state would be set, and then you would have your the desired output. Step number 3 is where it gets tricky. If you remember, the data model should have a one-on-one map to the DOM. The content part is easy, right? We just use the onChange function. But for achieving the selection state, to ensure that the selection state, which is represented by the state in the parent component, is same as stays in sync with the selection that is attributed by the DOM. This is because the working of the native onChange function of the text area, the onChange function of the native text area only fires when you enter some characters. So when you select some text, when you click on the editor, when you have a focus in the editor, the onChange function doesn't get fired. So you cannot use the onChange function to update the, you can use the onChange function, but you have to account for the selection state. To solve this, what we would do is we would add all those events, select, click, focus, and key up, and whenever the component mounts, we will add in a selection state listener, and we would, whenever those events happen, we would constantly keep updating the selection state in the parent component. And we would also use a central function to update the text area. This is again because of the tricky behavior of onChange. You cannot pass custom content through onChange because the event that gets fired behaves a little differently across different browsers. So what you would instead do is you would hook up this onChange function to this central function which we would use to update the text area. So the onChange would look like this .update text area, and the content, it reads it from the DOM, and selection, it reads it from the DOM. Get selection is a helper function for the same. And update text area, we can use update text area for passing custom content and selection to the text area. So imagine you have a plain text editor, and you have some text, say hello, and you have some selection. You have the selection over the entire hello text, and you want to add bold to that particular text area, to that particular selection. Now imagine this becomes really easy, right? Because we are managing content and selection in the state. Think of a bold token adder function. It'll take the old state and it'll spit out the new state with those tokens added to the selection. We can use update text area for the same. I'll demonstrate that. So if you do all this, then lo and behold, you have what are called tightly controlled text areas. So if I write hello, we can see that the content is hello, and the start offset is at 5, the end offset is at 5. And imagine the bold token adder operation. I'll just emulate it by passing in the content. Imagine that a function is doing this, not me. You'll have hello with star appended to it to denote that it's bold, and it'll have additional offsets 2 and then 7. And then when you set the state, you have this the new content state as you would have imagined it. So those are tightly controlled text areas. And I have also written about this in detail in one of my blog posts in Hashnode. So yeah, if we follow this data model, so this is the key takeaway again. Please don't beat me for reading it again. A data model to represent your entire data state, well-defined set of edit operations, and a one-on-one mapping of the data model to the DOM. If you follow this model, you will really build text editors no matter what is no matter what clients consume your editor, be it a mobile or be it a desktop browser. So does this have any problems in terms of React? Yes, we do, because we are using update text area and not using the onChange, and because of not using the onChange, the undo is broken. The text area doesn't know anymore that some content has been added, and the undo manager of the native text area is really broken. So how can we fix this? You don't need to fret, because you have the entire source of the truth in your state. You can use a solution like Easy Undo, and you can hook up your state to be managed by Easy Undo. And you can also have key binding functions like Control Z, Command Z to get undo states and redo states from an undo manager like this. So that has been my talk on building text editors for the web. I hope you got something out of it. And I am on GitHub at fatman-, and I'm on Twitter at _Psychishore. If you have any questions, I would love to take them.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I have actually multiple questions.
Okay.
So my first one is on the selection models.
All right.
So like how does it handle selections across node boundaries, for example? So I'm like halfway in a paragraph and I've selected text halfway up to the next paragraph.
Correct.
And like how does it, I mean, is there support for those kind of complex selection
You're
models?
talking about the plain text areas?
Yes.
So in plain text areas, the entire content is managed in the state, right?
Sure.
So the paragraph model that you're talking about doesn't really exist as far as data is concerned. So it's just a long blob of text with enters appended in between of the text. And when you select something, it would automatically give you the start offset and the end offset because of the code we have written. So.
But my question was more, like let's say you have a paragraph which is bold.
Correct.
And you have the second paragraph which is in italics.
Correct.
And then you have the selection going from
correct
halfway in the first paragraph and
Yes.
going halfway into the second paragraph.
Correct.
So there you automatically have nodes which have some significance.
Correct.
So
If you're talking about the rich text editor.
rich text editor.
Okay.
Sorry.
If you're talking about the rich text editor, then Draft maintains different blocks. I'll quickly show you. So this is the simplest editor, right? So for example, if I write something, hello, I'll actually show it to you in here. Hello, my name is Sai. So these are two paragraphs you're saying, correct? And you have some selection across these two different paragraphs. And you're asking how selection state would represent across these different boundaries. So I'll show you here. 1 second, I am really sorry. Hello, Sai. And when I select this and I log the editor state, the buttons are not here. Okay. Hello, Sai. And I select some text. And in the selection state, you can see that the anchor key is in the first node and the focus key is the second node, the second paragraph. And you have the anchor offset at 1 in that particular block key, and the focus offset is at 2, which is here. So that's how Draft.js manages selection state. It keeps track of where the selection state lies across, and that's how it manages it.
My second question is on the data model specifically. So I'm guessing that so far your data model is HTML.
Yeah.
But,
the data model is not HTML, it's a JavaScript object.
It's a JavaScript object. So
it's actually an immutable JS data structure, and what I've shown you is the JavaScript representation of that immutable JS object.
So my question is, what if I want to, let's assume I have a docbook document.
You have?
I have a docbook document.
Okay.
Docbook or SVG or whatever.
Correct.
So can I use Draft.js to basically take the docbook and represent it as a native
Correct.
data model?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking that you have a docbook and you want to use the Draft.js editor for that?
Exactly.
Yeah, you can. So Draft.js, what I didn't touch upon in this talk is Draft.js gives you utility functions. So the entire editor state that you have in immutable JS structure, you have something called convert to raw, which you can use on this data structure, on the content state actually, and it would emit you a JavaScript object which you can store in your backend. And then afterwards you can hydrate, you can take this JavaScript object and then you can use the utility convert from raw. So You're basically asking about how you would store the data, how you would manage the data, correct?
I'm talking about so you have the data in the editor.
Correct.
Ultimately, that gets stored.
Yes.
So in this case, let's say I want to store it in the file system.
Store it in the?
In the file system.
Okay.
So think of something like a Word document.
Okay.
So let's imagine I want to build an editor like Word,
Yeah.
but within the browser.
Yeah.
But
that makes sense.
Yeah. So
You can write custom parsers to edit this data. So I have given you the example of the HashNode rich text editor, right? So we have built a custom parser. What it does is it takes this editor state and then it chunks out, it gives you out this plain markdown file. So you can very well maintain that text in a plain text format. You can very well build parsers that would convert this data structure into a word model, provided that you have some API that does that. Or you can build your own custom parsers. We have built custom parsers for Markdown.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello.
We have so many good editors in CodePen.io and something like Sublime. So the features of Sublime, like multiple cursors, multiple selections, like will they be in the scope of this? Like, if yes, then how would you go about it?
That's actually a very good question. Multiple selections is currently would not be possible with the data model that's represented by Draft.js. And as far as the Sublime text editor that you have given, the examples that you've given, they are also not plain text editors, they are WYSIWYG editors. So you have syntax highlighting, right? So what internally happens is whenever you write some code, an AST is formed, an abstract syntax tree, and the corresponding keywords are found. For example, if you write const x equal to 5, the const is syntax edited in a different way, the x is syntax edited in a different way. So that's actually an example of WYSIWYG. That's number one. And number two, no, it's not possible in Draft.js right now, but there is actually an issue that's ongoing which would give us tree-like structures for Draft.js data model. Then you would have then you can have multiple editor instances. Then you can have multiple selection states as well. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
Firstly, a great talk.
Thank you.
So I have used Draft.js before, and how do we kind of change the text? So on change, you're getting the new editor state.
Correct.
Can I make modifications on that editor state? And well, how do I make edits on those? Because I've kind of tried to use decorators, and I've faced instances of the cursor jumping. So,
right.
Like
so there's an issue which has already, the cursor jumping thing,
Yes.
that was an issue in 0.09 which has been solved in 0.10. That was because of the native Chrome behavior. And number two, on whether you can use onChange to do edits or not, we did something like this in HashNode. We had what we call a post change function. What it essentially did, now imagine a situation where you're typing @ what's your name?
Vivek.
Okay, if I type @Vivek, we have to show user mentions, right? So whenever I update the editor state, my post change function, which is fired inside the onChange function, it would check whether there are any patterns of that at the present cursor, and if there are, just render an extra component for showing the user mentions, and you can have normal interactions like pressing enter and
So
stuff.
do you directly modify editor state, or do you kind of convert it to raw, modify the data?
We don't modify the editor state at all. This thing that I'm talking about, the post change function, it doesn't change the editor state, but it checks the patterns in editor state, and then dynamically adds new components. And in those new components, for example, if I select your name and press enter, then we would sort of call the onChange function again with this new editor state, which represents an entity with your user mention.
So where do you place the post change? Not getting that.
Okay.
Or maybe I'll catch you offline. Maybe I think.
Yeah, cool.
Hi Sai,
Hi.
great talk to end the day.
Thank you.
My question is, let's say if I have a very large document containing, more than 10K characters or something, then each character is representing a node in that tree, right? If I select the entire text and I do some operation on it, example a bold operation, then it will go and change the style properties of each of the characters. So will that become a performance issue anytime, beyond a certain character limit or something? Because in that scenario it would have to traverse 10,000 nodes, for example.
Well, that's a good use case, but generally we don't see edit operations of that sort. We have actually tested it for 50,000 characters of text. The edit operations, if there are multiple characters, it typically takes 600 milliseconds, 700 milliseconds. But when the text selection is that long and it's under a second, it's a performance issue that we are really okay with. You can also look at this thing in Word, MS Word. So even in MS Word, if you select really long block of text and you apply some operation, it lags just a bit. So because these are not the normal use case where a user is not selecting the entire text and then he is adding bold to that character, so we don't mind the minor performance issues from there. Does it answer your question? Yeah. Hi.
Great talk.
Thank you.
My question is, I'm already using.
Could you speak a little bit louder? I think its mic is not on.
Okay. So I'm already using an editor.
Mhm.
All right, and with that editor, I'm generating an HTML, which I'm saving it in the
Mhm.
background database.
Mhm.
Now, if I
Which
use
editor you're using, if I might ask?
TinyMCE,
Oh, okay, TinyMC. Awesome.
so is it possible to import that HTML in GraphJS?
Absolutely, absolutely. So GraphJS has a lot of, as I've said, convert to raw utility function. Similarly, GraphJS has convert from HTML and convert to HTML, which would change your HTML to the data structure as you would need it. Now, if you have special structures like mentions and all, which have markup that is custom to your own product, then you would have to change the original convert from HTML a bit. So there is this, you know, HubSpot, right? HubSpot has actually forked the draft's default convert from HTML, and it has implemented middleware in convert from HTML, so you can write custom parsers to build HTML however you want it.
Hi, Saib.
Hi.
So I was working with Grammarly support on the text editors. So GraphJS and the rich text editor Grammarly doesn't support.
Yeah,
Is there any workaround you would have worked on for Grammarly?
No, unfortunately not, because this is an issue that has been opened by the core Grammarly team. It's not an issue with GraphJS as such, but it's an issue with the content editable, the native content editable. There is a team which has formed around this, which are working on this issue. Hopefully, we'll get a solution soon.
Okay, I have one more question, and that's related to, since you mentioned that the state is basically tracked. Is there some kind of native support for, tracking changes? Like the way you see in Word, deleted text is shown with a strike through. So is there some kind of native support for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, there is. So basically, it's just a data structure, right? It's just an immutable data structure. So however you want to represent it, it's completely up to you. So GraphJS has a rich set of APIs for editing the editor state, but in case you need to do something that GraphJS APIs don't support, because it's all an immutable data structure, you can just dig in and use the immutable JS API to edit it the way you want.
I think that was the last question. Wow, we made it all the way to the end of the conference.
Yay!
Thank you, Sai, for the last talk of the day.
Thank you.